This is the brief on that big debate. Is America basically a graveyard for social movements? Okay, so here's the idea, right? It's pretty provocative. It compares America to Afghanistan, the famous graveyard of empires. Does America just kind of absorb big moral crusades, drain all their energy, and let them fade away? Let's break down the three main ways people see this. First, you've got the graveyard argument itself. It goes like this. America seems to play along with movements, right? Think civil rights, or maybe diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI. It throws some money, sets up some committees, but deep down, there's this powerful inertia, this resistance to real change. And eventually, the movement just runs out of steam, that's the entropy part, and things quietly slide back. Schools might resegregate, DEI gets dismantled, you get the picture. Okay, but then there's the pushback. The second view says, hold on, America isn't a graveyard, it's more like an evolving battleground. Here, movements don't just die, they kind of compost. They leave something behind. Progress isn't always a straight line. It layers up, it morphs. And get this, the backlash? That's actually proof the movement had an impact. Think about Occupy Wall Street. It might be gone, but we all talk about the 1% now, right? That language stuck? So which is it? A graveyard or a compost heap? Well, that brings us to the third idea, kind of a synthesis. Maybe it's less about dying and more about being preserved. This view suggests America is like a mausoleum with Wi-Fi. Movements like #MeToo or Black Lives Matter get hashtags shared, even monetized online. They look alive, always curated, always visible. But does that curated version actually lead to deep structural change or just keep the illusion going while the real energy fades? It really makes you think about speed versus staying power.
So yeah, the struggle for justice here, it feels like this constant tug of war between that deep cultural inertia and the slow, layered buildup of change over time.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are diving into a comparison today that, well, at first glance, it sounds like pure dramatic hyperbole, maybe.
It definitely grabs your attention.
It does. But I promise you, when you actually look at the source material we have, it becomes this intellectually really rigorous and high-stakes conflict.
Absolutely.
The core question before us is this. Is America fundamentally a graveyard, not for, foreign armies or empires, but for the social movements, the ones that attempt to fundamentally change its culture and politics?
That is certainly a provocative analogy to kick things off. Our listener sent us two incredibly rich sources that are, well, they're locked in direct intellectual combat, really.
Right.
We have one powerful, if maybe deeply skeptical essay arguing for that graveyard hypothesis.
Okay.
The idea that American culture has this systemic, highly effective way of absorbing, exhausting, and then ultimately neutralizing the energy of reformers.
Okay, absorbing, exhausting, neutralizing. Got it. And then the counter.
And then we have the equally detailed and I think really thoughtful rebuttal. This counter source insists that, viewing these apparent failures as a graveyard, that's just cynicism mistaken for realism.
Ah, okay. So it's not realism, it's pessimism.
Pretty much. It argues that change isn't vanishing, it's sedimenting. It layers itself, into the foundation of society, often in ways that maybe we don't immediately recognize.
Sedimenting, like layers building up over time. Interesting.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack this, it's high-stakes intellectual sparring match for you, the listener. It's really an argument about the fundamental nature of American progress.
Does the change stick? Does the change brought by these massive movements actually last, or is it just temporary?
Right. The first source suggests a frankly depressing conclusion that maybe all progress is ultimately reversible because the culture just fundamentally resists disruption.
Okay.
But the second source says the complete opposite, that progress is recursive. It builds on past struggles, even when those struggles might have looked like failures at the time.
Recursive, like it loops back and builds on itself. Okay. So we're going to be looking at the core forces then that shape cultural resistance and change.
Yeah, and it's a battle defined by these really interesting metaphors: inertia, entropy, compost, and landfills.
Inertia, entropy, compost, landfills, that sets up the conflict clearly. It defines whether you should look at American idealism as, I guess, a tragedy, or maybe as a complex, slow-motion victory that just needs constant vigilance.
That's the core tension.
Okay, let's get started. Let's dig into section 1, the graveyard hypothesis. Okay, let's unpack this core, really startling analogy from the first source. The author kicks off by defining Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires, a name it earned, through centuries of frustrating foreign intervention, the British, the Soviets, and most recently the United States.
Yeah, and that phrase graveyard of empires, it's used not just like dramatically, but almost scientifically in the source. The source defines it as this kind of geopolitical truth rooted in a really profound cultural endurance. Afghanistan's winning strategy, it argues, has never really been about defeating superior military forces in, open battle.
Right.
It is about outlasting them. It plays the long game.
Just waiting them out.
Exactly. It simply waits for the foreign armies and governments to use up all their energy, all their political will, their resources, knowing they have, eternity on their side, essentially.
And this waiting game involves a kind of surface compliance, right? The source argues that's key to its success.
Yes, highly deceptive, almost like an act of strategic passive resistance. Afghanistan will, accept the money, the aid, the resources.
Take the help.
It allows superficial changes. Maybe a few schools get built in the cities. New laws are briefly enforced. Foreign ideals get promoted. In the media they control, that kind of thing.
But underneath
that veneer, that surface compliance, the loyalty to the older ways, to the tribes, the local identity, the enduring religious structures, that remains strong. It's hidden. It's untouched.
So the local people, they smile, nod, take the cash.
Yeah, they say what the occupiers want to hear, maybe, but they keep their core identity intact. They're just waiting for the occupying force to blink first, to get tired.
So if the foreign force, drained and, eventually defeated by exhaustion, leaves, what happens then, according to this analogy?
Afghanistan simply shrugs it all off. Everything they tried to build. That's the core mechanism described.
Wow.
The foreign-funded schools close, the new laws vanish, the Western systems collapse, and the culture returns, sometimes almost violently, to its previous state.
All that effort. Just buried. Wasted energy.
Wasted energy. Buried in silence. That's the picture painted.
And here's the really provocative twist. The source applies this exact, four-stage mechanism directly to America. But the invaders here aren't armies. They're social movements.
Exactly. In the American cultural context, the invaders are the crusades, the slogans, the demands for systemic change, whether it's, environmentalism, racial justice, gender equality, you name it.
Okay.
They arrive with protests, maybe massive corporate campaigns, and this undeniable moral mission to shift the culture. And crucially, initially, it looks like they're succeeding, wildly succeeding.
So the system's response isn't violent suppression.
Yeah.
Because that might spark a real revolution.
Right. According to this source, that's not the tactic. Instead, the American system plays along. It opens the door wide and immediately starts dumping resources into the movement.
Dumping resources, like what?
Companies declare allegiance, throwing corporate funding at it. Suddenly it becomes an instant, often highly profitable cause. Governments rewrite rules, schools create new DEI programs, activists might transition into highly paid institutional jobs.
I see. So they get brought inside the system.
Precisely. And this is where the core critique of Source One really lies. This initial compliance gives reformers a completely false, maybe even intoxicating belief that they are winning, and winning easily.
Because the system isn't fighting them, it's integrating them.
It's integrating them, yeah.
Which brings us to the draining mechanism. This feels counterintuitive. The essay argues that throwing massive amounts of money, attention, institutional approval that actually drains the movement's authentic, maybe revolutionary energy faster. Why?
It's a really interesting point. Because the movement spends its finite energy pushing against what seems like a yielding surface, pushing for easy surface-level wins, right?
With a new corporate mandate or a celebrity endorsement.
Or a trending hashtag, exactly. The energy just disperses into this, bureaucratic institutional ether. Activists might go from organizing radical change on the streets to managing internal corporate communications.
So the passion gets converted into job security and memos.
Pretty much. That's the argument. It's the ultimate co-optation. It's not a violent defeat. It's what the source actually calls death by 1,000 supportive memos.
Wow. Death by 1,000 supportive memos. That's grim.
It is. The movement exhausts itself pushing into this institutional landscape that seems receptive, only to find that the core cultural inertia, that loyalty to the old ways, it remains solid. It just waited it out.
And the source says there's a consistent historical pattern here.
Yes, cited again and again. Big surge, then surface compliance, followed inevitably by the rollback and fade.
Okay, let's run through the specific historical examples used to sort of prove this pattern. The civil rights movement is the first one, maybe the most painful example cited in this light.
Yeah, I mean, it won huge federal laws, right? Outlawing segregation, securing voting rights, massive victories.
Absolutely huge.
But the author notes that while the laws changed on paper, the cultural reality often snapped back. Decades later, you see funding for integrated schools evaporate, local zoning laws creating de facto resegregation in housing.
Right, the enforcement dwindles.
Enforcement of federal mandates dwindled as the political pressure faded. The energy just ran out. And the systemic inertial forces, racism, economic division, they quietly returned things to something approximating the status quo, albeit maybe under different legal terms.
Okay, so the form changes, but the substance remains.
That's the argument. Then you have affirmative action. It fundamentally shifted who was in higher education professional fields for decades, provided critical opportunities.
Definitely. A huge impact.
But what happened? It faced decades of attrition, legal challenges, cultural resentment, until it was gradually weakened, dismantled at the state level, and then ultimately rolled back by the Supreme Court.
So the initial force dissipated.
The initial force dissipated, and the system leveraged its legal institutions to kind of restore the previous equilibrium.
What about something faster, like Occupy Wall Street?
That's a key example for rapid dissipation. It filled city centers with protest, right? Dramatically transformed the public conversation around wealth disparity, the 1%. Huge visibility.
Yeah, everyone was talking about it.
And yet, its physical presence vanished almost overnight. Its immediate legislative impact was minimal, and the physical organizing capacity just evaporated once the police swept the encampments.
Gone quickly. And the recent examples you mentioned happened even faster, proving the mechanism is maybe accelerating.
Well, the source suggests it's still very active. DEI programs, for instance, they became mandatory almost everywhere following major cultural shifts, right?
Felt like overnight.
But the source highlights they're now being quietly dismantled or facing massive political and corporate backlash. That's leading to hiring freezes, restructuring.
Swift reversal.
Or look at the trans rights campaigns. Made massive cultural waves very quickly, achieved recognition, policy shifts in some areas.
Yeah, significant gains.
Yet in response, laws and policies are now being rapidly reversed across multiple states, particularly targeting youth participation, healthcare.
So the compliance window was really brief before the resistance kicked in hard.
Extremely brief, yeah. The inertial resistance, as the source puts it.
And the reason for this pattern, according to this source, isn't really about ideology. It's attributed to physics.
Kind of, yeah. Two powerful scientific forces that shape culture, inertia and entropy.
Okay, explain inertia in this cultural context.
So inertia here is the massive tendency of a society, a culture, to stay exactly the same. Imagine like a gigantic cultural body at rest.
Okay.
It stays at rest unless a continuous, enormous, and really exhausting effort is applied to push it. The moment that push stops,
It snaps back.
culture, like physics, wants to return to its comfortable starting state. The status quo is always the path of least resistance. It takes constant energy to keep things changed.
Got it. And then there's entropy.
Right. Entropy is that slow, inevitable decay of order into disorder. Think about new systems, new laws, new habits. They require constant maintenance, energy input.
Like upkeep.
Exactly. If the initial moral fervor fades, if activists move on to other things, entropy simply begins to erase the gains. Bureaucracy decays, the new standards are forgotten, accountability disappears.
It just falls apart if you stop actively holding it together.
It's like stopping the maintenance on a highly complex computer system, right? It won't crash instantly, but it will slowly, inexorably fail until the original disorder, or maybe the previous state, returns.
So the conclusion of this first deeply skeptical perspective is pretty stark then.
It is. America functions as a cultural black hole. It swallows the energy, the enthusiasm, the reforms, the hard-won surface victories of the movement.
Call of everything.
Absorbs everything, converts that energy into institutional exhaustion, maybe apathy, and then returns to its original state, weary of the effort required to fend off the change in the first place.
Wow. Okay. That is a profoundly bleak assessment, a cultural black hole. If that's true, I mean, why do people keep fighting? Why is this intellectual tension so persistent?
That's the perfect question, and it's precisely where the second source steps in with a really vigorous rebuttal. It calls that graveyard analogy cynicism mistaken for realism.
Okay, cynicism mistaken for realism. I like that framing.
Yeah.
So what's the core argument here?
The core argument is that change doesn't vanish. It's sediments.
Sedimentation again. Okay, explain that.
The counter perspective immediately challenges this idea of a simple snapback. It argues that movements don't actually disappear. They morph, they fracture, maybe they adapt, and they often return.
So they don't die, they transform.
Exactly. The claim that America just returns to its original state ignores the durable, often invisible changes that remain layered into the foundation of society, what the essay calls recursive progress.
Recursive progress, meaning it builds on itself. Okay, let's test that. Where's the evidence of this sedimentation in those very examples that Source 1 claimed were definitive failures? Where are the building blocks left behind?
Okay, great question. Let's take the civil rights movement again. Source 1 focuses on the quiet resegregation, right?
Right, the rollback.
This source argues that, yes, that happened, but the movement also fundamentally reshaped not just the federal legal landscape, but public consciousness in a way that is irreversible.
Okay, consciousness shift.
And crucially, it established the legal and rhetorical foundation for subsequent struggles. The infrastructure of justice, the legal templates, the language of rights, the mechanisms for challenging state power, that was largely built by the civil rights movement.
Ah, so it laid the groundwork.
It laid the groundwork.
Yeah.
That became the soil for disability rights, for LGBTQ plus rights, for immigrant rights movements decades later. They used the tools created earlier.
So the argument is that even if the immediate goal was partially rolled back, the possibility and the structure for future justice was permanently secured.
That's the idea. Or look at the courts rolling back affirmative action. Source 2 insists that effort was far from useless.
Oh, so?
Its cultural legacy. Think about the decades of diverse hiring practices, the whole generation of highly visible professionals of color who became teachers, doctors, lawyers because of it, that cannot simply be erased by a court ruling.
Right. Those people exist, their influence exists.
It's a permanent demographic and, maybe more importantly, an expectation shift that persists outside of any specific court mandate. The culture changed.
Okay, that makes sense. What about Occupy Wall Street? Source 1 said it vanished overnight.
Yeah, Source 2 has a very different take. The counter-argument is that it profoundly transformed the political lexicon.
The language we use.
Exactly. Terms like the 1% and income inequality, they went from being like niche academic concepts to mainstream issues almost overnight.
That's true. You hear them constantly, yeah.
And that shapes legislation. It shapes electoral platforms across the political spectrum today. Every politician now has to have some answer on inequality, right? That change is directly traceable to Occupy's rhetoric.
So the movement wasn't physically erased. Its vocabulary, its core concerns got absorbed, but not as poison like Source 1 suggested.
Not as poison, but as new indelible building blocks into the civic language. That's the argument. The focus shifts from the dramatic visibility of the protest itself to the persistence of the ideas and the structures built by that initial energy.
Okay, that's a powerful counter. Let's revisit inertia. Source 1 framed it as the absolute enemy of progress, the force always pulling things back.
Right, the big bad force.
Source 2 offers a significantly different, more complex view. It describes inertia as, paradoxically, democracy's safety mechanism. How does that work?
This is a really crucial pivot in the argument. The slowness, the frustration, the institutional inertia that activists rightly complain about. That is, in many ways, the necessary price of maintaining a deliberative democracy.
The price of stability.
Kind of. Inertia acts as a shock absorber. It prevents rapid, radical overcorrections that could quickly lead to tyranny or even civil war. Liberal democracy is fundamentally reliant on deliberation, on incrementalism.
Which is frustrating.
Super frustrating to activists, but it's also what keeps movements, however powerful they seem in the moment, from instantly becoming purges or causing complete societal breakdown.
So if change happens slowly, that's not necessarily a sign of failure. It's proof the system is working as designed to maximize stability, prevent chaos.
That's the interpretation. The culture resists traumatic shifts because stability itself is seen as a foundational good, maybe the foundational good.
Okay, and this leads directly to the central, really powerful metaphor of the rebuttal. Movements aren't buried in a graveyard.
They compost.
They compost. Okay, I love that idea. Explain the composting metaphor in a cultural sense.
Yeah, the compost metaphor is really at the core of Source 2's optimism. Movements, even while they might decay, lose their immediate institutional power, maybe fade from the headlines, they break down into the soil of public life.
Okay.
And that decay fertilizes future growth. It provides these essential nourishment, the political precedents, the moral urgency, the network connections necessary for the next wave of activism to emerge. and hopefully emerge stronger.
So the material isn't wasted or buried, it's repurposed. It becomes fertilizer.
Exactly. It's repurposed.
Give us some examples of this composting process in action. Where can we see that?
Okay, think about the feminist movement of the 1970s. That wave secured things like Title IX, normalized the language of women's leadership to some extent.
Right.
Did it vanish? Source 2 says no. That work broke down, composted, and decades later, it directly fueled the #MeToo era. The earlier movement's legal frameworks, its cultural critiques, its institutional networks, those were built upon by the later movement, which arguably reached an even higher altitude of impact because the soil was richer.
Okay, building on the past. What else?
Similarly, think about the 1960s anti-war protests. They led to this deep cultural skepticism toward foreign interventionism that is now almost bipartisan, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that feels true. Much more caution now.
Right. Even if a specific anti-war movement failed to stop Vietnam or failed to stop the Iraq War, the resulting compost ensured that every future administration has to justify foreign wars far more rigorously than ever before. The ground shifted.
The default changed.
The default changed. And perhaps most significantly in recent memory, Black Lives Matter. Even if the massive street protests quieted down, the source argues it permanently shifted public opinion on policing, on incarceration, on systemic racism across key demographics. You see it in polling data and conversations.
It changed the conversation permanently.
It built enduring local institutions. It changed media reporting standards. It provided the language and framework that continues to reemerge under new names and faces. The energy might have dispersed, but the structure, the compost, remains. Ready for the next cycle.
Okay, let's move to the idea of backlash. Source 1 saw the rollback, the push against DEI, the attacks on affirmative action as proof the system was winning, right? Proof of the graveyard.
Yeah, proof of the inevitable snapback.
Source 2 completely flicks this. It argues that backlash is simply proof of impact.
Absolutely. The source insists that when entrenched, powerful hierarchies, whether that's white supremacy, patriarchy, corporate oligarchy, whatever, when they feel threatened, they fight back.
So the fight back means you landed a blow.
Exactly. If the movement was irrelevant, if it hadn't actually changed anything, there would just be silence. The fact that political groups are spending massive resources today to roll back DEI policies or limit reproductive freedom, that's definitive evidence that the preceding movement worked. It forced a political contest.
So it's not erasure. It's just the next phase of the struggle.
It's the next necessary front in an ongoing democratic struggle. It's proof of life, not death.
And finally, the rebuttal insists that America is fundamentally different from that Afghanistan analogy because the movement leaders aren't foreign invaders. The source says, we are the system.
Yeah, this is a crucial philosophical distinction, I think. Afghanistan successfully resisted empires because the invaders were always external, right? Imposing alien values.
Right.
Outsiders. In America, the reformers, the civil rights marchers, the climate activists, the organizers for social justice, they are citizens. They are part of the fabric of the nation itself.
So the fight is internal.
The fight for justice is America happening to itself. The essay suggests the system cannot truly wait out its own people in the same way because the people are the system. The struggle is internal, dynamic, and therefore fundamentally necessary and maybe unavoidable.
Okay, so we've established these two powerful competing worldviews, the graveyard of exhaustion versus the evolving battleground of compost. This last section is where the sources seem to push past just simple disagreement. Right. And engage in a higher level analysis of what success even looks like.
Yeah, this is where it gets really nuanced. Both sides, interestingly, seem to agree on one basic point. Things change, and change does accumulate over time.
Okay, so they agree change happens.
They agree change happens. But the divergence really sharpens on the questions of velocity and retention. How fast does it happen, and how much actually sticks?
Right. The graveyard view focuses on that rapid enthusiasm, the quick burnout, the systemic absorption that neutralizes the energy.
Quick burn, quick fade.
While the compost view focuses on the slow, maybe agonizing layering that eventually adds up to something durable, even if it takes generations.
Slow build, deep roots.
Exactly. Let's return to inertia one last time.
Sure.
Source 2 championed it earlier as a safety mechanism protecting stability.
Right, the shock absorber for democracy.
But the critique offered later, even within that second source, challenges this positive view.
Yeah.
It argues inertia isn't actually a neutral force, it's biased.
Yes. That's a fantastic distinction raised later on. The source notes that cultural inertia does not treat all shocks equally. It cushions wealth and entrenched power much, much better than it cushions demands for justice.
How so? Give an example.
Well, inertia doesn't just protect stability in the abstract, it protects the beneficiaries of that existing stability. So the institutional slowness of democracy might protect against, say, dictators, sure.
Which is good.
Which is good. But it also, in the words of the source, keeps landlords, rich and entrenched corporations dominant. It makes challenging that kind of power incredibly difficult and slow.
So it reframes inertia not as just a neutral shock absorber, but as a deliberate, heavy protector of the existing distribution of power and wealth.
Exactly. It has a thumb on the scale.
Okay. This leads directly into a really critical discussion about what actually happens to the movement's material, its energy. If it's not simply buried, graveyard, and it's not always composting, what's the third option? The source calls it the landfill problem.
Right, the landfill problem. This is the concept of descent metabolized?
Descent metabolized, yeah.
Does the energy truly re-enter the civic soil, available for future growth like compost? Or is it merely contained, sealed off, packaged?
Yeah, like putting trash in a landfill liner?
Precisely. The critical analysis here suggests that America's consumer culture, its corporate culture, has marketers, not gardeners. The movement's authentic, radical moral energy gets converted into brand content.
Into something sellable.
Sellable, easily digestible, easily ignored once the trend passes. It becomes cultural waste sealed away, not fertile soil.
Okay, give us the concrete examples of this corporate containment, this landfill effect, where the movement's power is neutralized by basically turning it into a product.
Yeah, think about how feminism often becomes empowerment branding.
See that everywhere.
Right. A struggle for fundamental legal and economic equality gets repurposed to sell makeup or clothing lines or maybe aspirational corporate programs that, change very little about the actual wage gap or power structures.
Okay. What about racial justice?
Black Lives Matter, the source argues, often gets reduced to a diversity memo, an HR directive, maybe a mandatory seminar. Performative, exactly. Rather than a fundamental redistribution of resources or a real change in police accountability structures, it's contained within the existing corporate or institutional framework.
And environmentalism, same pattern.
Same pattern. The urgent moral crisis gets converted into, what, a carbon tracking app or a marketing campaign that sells you flights under the guise of offsetting your footprint.
Right, solving the problem by consuming more.
Exactly. The system uses the moral fervor of the movement to circulate outrage, maybe generate clicks and ad revenue, and ultimately profit from it, all while maintaining the basic equilibrium and giving the illusion of progress.
It's what the source calls the tragic comedy of American idealism. That's quite a phrase.
It is. We are the system, right? That means every reformer is fundamentally funded by the very economy they critique.
Right.
Amplified by the algorithms that profit from their outrage, hosted on the platforms that monetize their dissent.
So we don't overthrow the system. We just refresh its user interface.
That's the bleak suggestion. The fight is happening inside the machine, which means the system itself benefits from the churn, from the constant updates and arguments.
Which brings us to the ultimate contrast in historical viewpoints presented. Is the process a spiral or a treadmill?
Yeah, two very different images of history. The optimistic view, the compost view maybe, holds that history is a spiral. We revisit old ground fighting for voting rights again or economic fairness again, but we do it at a slightly higher altitude each time.
Having learned lessons, built better tools.
Having learned lessons, built more inclusive systems maybe on top of the old ones. Progress, but slow and looping.
Okay, and the skeptical view.
The skeptical view, the treadmill view, argues that it's perpetual churn with zero net displacement. We are running extremely hard, experiencing great exhaustion, constantly updating the scenery.
New laws, new hashtags, new language.
Right. The scenery updates, but the systemic arrangement of power, the incline of the treadmill, it remains almost identical.
So it feels like forward motion, but it's just maintaining the same systemic arrangement. The same people benefit, the status quo remains comfortable for those at the top.
That's the treadmill argument, and this leads to the final and maybe the most powerful counter-metaphor offered by this refined analysis in the second source. America isn't a graveyard, because that implies death and forgetting.
Okay, not a graveyard.
It is a mausoleum with Wi-Fi.
A mausoleum with Wi-Fi. Okay, unpack that. Mausoleum suggests careful curation, preservation, not just burial or decay.
Exactly. Think about our movements, civil rights, pride, #MeToo. They are all still highly visible, aren't they?
Yeah, constantly referenced.
They are preserved behind glass, hashtagged, illuminated, sometimes monetized. Curation becomes the tool of neutralization.
How so?
The movement doesn't disappear. It becomes a piece of history, an exhibit in the museum. It is accessible. That's the Wi-Fi part. You can look it up, learn about it. It's studied. It's even celebrated on holidays.
Right, like Black History Month or Pride Month.
Exactly. But the very act of preserving it behind glass, curating it, neutralizes its radical living power, its ability to challenge the present order.
So nothing disappears,
Yeah.
but maybe nothing breathes. Nothing truly threatens the status quo anymore.
That's the chilling suggestion of the mausoleum metaphor. It's kept alive as an artifact, but its active force is contained. #tag outro.
Wow. We've covered some truly remarkable intellectual ground today, really digging into the nature of struggle itself in America. The core tension we've been exploring, it feels fundamental. Does America survive by waiting out movements until exhaustion prevails, swallowing their energy into that cultural black hole?
The graveyard model.
Or does it survive by arguing itself into coherence, forcing movements to compost into future progress, even if it's slow and messy?
The evolving battleground model.
Yeah,
The answer, as always, probably lies somewhere in the tension between those two positions, right?
usually does.
But the second source provides a really powerful moral underpinning to that struggle, I think. It insists that cynicism is a form of moral leisure.
Moral leisure, meaning it's easy to be cynical.
It's easy, while maintaining hope and persistent action is always the more courageous, the more demanding act. And, the very fact that we're engaged in this deep dive right now,
Yeah.
analyzing the fate of these struggles, critiquing the critiques, that itself is proof that the system is still breathing, it's still contested, the argument isn't over.
That's a hopeful thought in itself. It suggests that America's only real weapon against that cultural inertia, against decay, isn't necessarily a new law or a corporate mandate.
Maybe not.
It's the act of talking back, the constant maintenance of intellectual tension and argument. That act of persistent scrutiny, that's the engine of change. However slow or frustrating that treadmill might feel sometimes.
That seems to be the implication. The struggle itself is the sign of life.
Okay. So for you, the listener, as you look at today's cultural and political shifts, maybe consider this final thought, drawn from the source material, which really speaks to the heart of this whole deep dive. What is the defining difference, the functional difference, between progress that successfully sediments, becomes part of the foundation,
The compost.
and dissent that is merely curated, illuminated, maybe even monetized, put in that mausoleum by the very system it seeks to change?
Where does the necessary fertile compost stop and the sealed, neutralized landfill begin?
That's the question to ponder.
Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is what's quite a provocative analogy, really, drawn from the source material. It's this parallel between Afghanistan, famously called the graveyard of empires, and the idea that America might be, in its own way, a graveyard of movements. And this really centers on a pretty fundamental disagreement about how our political system, our cultural system, actually handles change. So the question is, does the American structure ultimately just absorb and sort of neutralize the energy of these big social demands, draining them until they fail? Or does it actually process them, integrate them, allowing movements to, morph, maybe compost, as the material suggests, and contribute to slow, maybe but lasting cumulative progress?
Okay.
For my part, I'll be arguing for the skeptical view that America is, structurally speaking, a graveyard, a place where deep change often turns out to be temporary, maybe just surface level, and ultimately gets rolled back.
And I can see why that view is appealing, especially, looking at the last few years of volatility. But I do think the graveyard metaphor, while it's definitely powerful, it kind of misunderstands the long arc of American history. So I'll be arguing that America is more like an evolving battleground. Progress here, look, it's undeniably slow, it's uneven, you have to keep fighting the same battles sometimes, but it is cumulative, I think, and it's lasting. For me, that struggle itself isn't really a sign of failure. It's the necessary engine of our kind of liberal democracy.
Right. So my core thesis, digging into that graveyard idea, is that America essentially outlasts its challengers. And in this context, the challengers are these big movements demanding really profound cultural, structural shifts, thinking back to civil rights decades ago, or Occupy Wall Street more recently, and this latest wave of social justice advocacy. This system, it seems to me, manages to nullify these demands using two powerful, almost simple forces: inertia and entropy.
Okay.
And maybe let's translate those sort of academic terms. Inertia is just the massive weight of the existing culture, existing laws, its deep tendency to just stay the same, right? To resist change and kind of snap back to the average.
And entropy? How does that fit in?
Right. And entropy is just the natural decay of any new system or law or habit, any gain, really, if you're not constantly supplying immense energy to keep it going. And I'd say the brilliance, maybe the insidious brilliance of the American system is that it offers surface compliance, often quite prematurely. It'll, throw some resources, offer praise, rewrite a few rules here and there, but these superficial changes, they strategically drain the movement's finite energy, its fuel. And once that peak energy fades, well, entropy kicks in, things start to decay, and inertia, that huge cultural weight, it just ensures the gains get rolled back. I mean, look at the evidence historically. Schools quietly started resegregating decades after the big civil rights wins. Voting rights protections have been chipped away piece by piece through courts and legislatures. And right now we're seeing DEI programs being, quietly dismantled or just defunded across universities, corporations. The system absorbs that initial shock, that energy, and ultimately, I'd argue, gives back nothing truly lasting in instructional terms.
See, I have to challenge that conclusion that the outcome is nothing lasting. That perspective, I think, confuses temporary setbacks, maybe legislative losses, with total systemic failure. Change here isn't like flipping a switch. It's not just reversible like that. It's more recursive, cumulative. It operates much more like a spiral, maybe. Movements don't just collapse into nothing. They compost. That's the term used, and I think it fits. Their immediate decay, it doesn't just vanish. It actually fertilizes future growth. It leaves behind a permanent residues, institutional, linguistic. Think about the anti-war movement back in the 60s and 70s. Okay, they didn't end the Vietnam War overnight, but they created this deep, widespread, almost institutional skepticism towards military interventionism that frankly defines major political decisions and public tolerance for foreign wars even today. That's a permanent shift, wouldn't you say?
In the political consensus?
Similarly, Black Lives Matter. It fundamentally shifted public opinion on systemic racism and policing. That cultural foundation, that awareness, it can't just be unlearned, even if the policy changes lag behind or face immediate political backlash. Backlash actually, in my view, isn't proof of failure. It's overwhelming proof of impact. The institutional slowness, that inertia you mentioned, I see that as the necessary price, maybe, of stability in a liberal democracy. It's what protects us, critically, from a rapid slide into tyranny or, radical centralized power.
Okay, let's delve into that idea, that concept of composting then, because you're suggesting this sort of organic renewal, but I actually see the system more containing that energy, kind of sealing it off. Let's look at the fate of that initial, revolutionary fire.
Okay, well, let's test the composting idea then. Take a major example like the feminist movement. Its energy didn't just disappear, right? It sedimented into the legal structure. It gave rise to Title IX, which, fundamentally changed education, athletics in this country. And that legal and cultural scaffolding, that then fed directly into movements we see today, like #MeToo, decades later. The cultural legacy of these movements, like the push for diverse, equitable workplaces that really started with affirmative action, even when the specific laws get struck down, that legacy can't just be undone overnight. It's seeded into our professional expectations now. A whole generation of leaders carries those values. And that, to me, is a lasting institutional legacy.
That's a compelling case for maybe cultural sedimentation, yeah. But I would frame the transformation of that energy differently. I'm just not convinced it's compost. I think the energy isn't recycled into, civic soil. It's more like it gets sealed into corporate packaging. It's containment. Reform gets domesticated, right? It gets rendered harmless. So feminism isn't just Title IX. It becomes empowerment branding that you see sold on T-shirts and mugs. Black Lives Matter becomes a a mandatory diversity memo, or maybe a corporate consultation requirement, but often without any real shift in, say, corporate spending or labor practices.
That's quite an indictment, though. You're basically saying all these movements just end up as marketing material?
Functionally, often yes. The system absorbs the vocabulary of the movement, and then it repurposes it as brand content. Environmentalism becomes an app where you track your personal carbon footprint, while the corporation sponsoring the app continues polluting its scale. This turns the system into what I'd maybe call a mausoleum with Wi-Fi, right? Movements get illuminated, they get hashtagged, they get monetized, they become intellectual property, essentially. But structurally, underneath it all, nothing really breathes. The market consumes the critical energy of the movement and then uses that very energy to fuel the engine of consumption it was supposed to be challenging in the first place.
But the very existence of that co-option, or even just the attempt at co-option, isn't that direct evidence of the movement's power? I mean, it implies the system had to respond, right? It faced an external pressure so significant that just ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. The fact that terms like, the 1% or income inequality, which really exploded out of Occupy Wall Street, are now absolutely mainstream political language, shaping election platforms, even proposals for tax legislation. That shows a fundamental change in the very terms of our economic debate. That's not just containment, surely. That's real political penetration.
The terms of the debate shift. I grant you that, but the underlying conditions often hold remarkably fast, and that brings us right back to that force you see as a necessary stabilizer, inertia. Now, I concede, institutional slowness probably prevents coups, prevents wild, radical swings. But I'd argue that this stability isn't neutral. Inertia cushions wealth far, far better than it cushions justice. It primarily protects the beneficiaries of stability.
How do you mean? Isn't stability inherently necessary for everyone, especially the vulnerable?
Yes, stability is needed, but stability is expensive. And the question is, who pays for it and who benefits most from it? Those aren't always the same groups. Inertia, the way I see it, means reforms consistently stall out at the level of representation, rather than moving towards genuine redistribution of wealth or power. So we see tremendous growth in diverse faces in positions of power, more women, more minorities in visible leadership roles, absolutely. But the fundamental economic power structures, they remain largely untouched. Inertia keeps landlords wealthy, it keeps major financial institutions secure, it keeps corporate profits soaring, even while the political class itself becomes superficially more reflective of the country's diversity. It prioritizes capital stability over, say, labor's justice.
Okay, I see the argument. And I don't deny that inertia often has a conservative bias in practice. But I think you might be asking institutional slowness to be something it just fundamentally cannot be. Rapidly egalitarian. Institutional slowness is democracy's shock absorber. It has to be. We want protection against the whims of a temporary majority, don't we? If we had zero inertia, imagine it. We'd have these rapid, potentially disastrous legislative overcorrections. Power would become far too centralized, far too responsive to every wave of populist fervor, which historically tends to lead towards tyranny, not more justice. Inertia is simply the arena, maybe a frustratingly slow arena, but a stable, predictable one where the long battle for change has to be fought. We have to accept the price of deliberation and incrementalism, if we want to avoid the alternatives of instability and chaos.
I agree we need stability, of course, but my concern is that the very incrementalism you praise leads only to what feels like dynamic equilibrium, this perpetual churn, lots of motion, but ultimately zero net displacement on that critical axis of wealth and power. And that leads directly to my view of the historical direction. I see the appearance of motion, yes, but I argue the system is essentially designed as a highly sophisticated treadmill.
Whereas I maintain historical record absolutely points to a spiral, not a treadmill. A spiral means, yes, each wave might revisit old ground, tackle similar issues, but always from a significantly higher altitude. The gains are cumulative. And some, I'd argue, become essentially irreversible. Think about same-sex marriage. Just a generation ago, it was literally unthinkable for the vast majority of Americans. But the legislative groundwork, the cultural groundwork laid over decades led to a fundamental normalization that isn't just going to be rolled back by the next election cycle. Or look at the dramatic shift in women's status. I mean, women now make up the majority of college graduates. That's a fundamental economic and cultural reality built on decades of tireless suffragist and feminist activism. These aren't just cyclical fluctuations. They are profound, cumulative cultural shifts built, I'd say, on the compost of past movements.
I certainly acknowledge those cultural shifts, the educational shifts, absolutely. But I still question the net displacement on the economic axis. The system seems brilliantly designed to give every generation the feeling of moving forward. And look, in some ways, maybe it is. But the underlying machinery, the machinery of consumption, of global capitalism, it ensures that each so-called revolution just becomes another product cycle. We protest inequality while, holding and using devices built by exploited labor in global supply chains. We decry the system's injustice using the system's own infrastructure, social media, etc., to get our message out. The steep incline of inequality, it feels like it remains, even if the scenery gets updated with new tech, new slogans, new brands of activism. It feels like a highly sophisticated treadmill, designed to keep the core power dynamics exactly where they are while granting us the illusion of perpetual progress.
Well, I think this tension we're exploring, it's actually incredibly productive. I honestly believe America evolves precisely because it manages to outlast that easy cynicism, that graveyard metaphor. The system endures, not by destroying its movements, but by internalizing their demands. Okay, slowly, imperfectly, yes, but internalizing them nonetheless. The ongoing, often frustrating fight for justice is the democratic process itself, and that ensures change, however slow it feels, is ultimately cumulative. It's ongoing. The very endurance of these movements, even when they get co-opted into corporate memos or feel temporarily quieted, that's evidence of systemic life, I think, not futility.
And my position, just to restate, remains that America survives largely by draining its challengers through this process of strategic absorption. Its core identity, particularly that fundamental economic structure and the inherent structural bias of inertia, remains remarkably intact. Movements get metabolized, turned into harmless commercial efforts or PR campaigns, and for the actual reformer, the choice too often seems to be either assimilation into the establishment or just sheer exhaustion. It's a remarkably efficient, self-preserving system in that sense.
Yet, the strength of the system, I'd argue, is that we are internal to it. This fight for justice isn't some external invasion that the system can just wait out, like an empire in Afghanistan. It is the internal mechanism of change. Afghanistan, perhaps, survives by waiting out empires. America, I think, evolves by arguing itself and arguing for itself into some kind of coherence, however messy.
Indeed. And the source material really forces us to confront this deep tension. We've looked at whether reform energy is composted and recycled, or if it ends up sealed in a corporate landfill, contained. We've debated if institutional slowness is primarily about necessary stability, or if it mainly functions to protect established wealth. The evidence, as we've discussed, is pretty robust on both sides. Ultimately, the listener has to weigh this evidence and determine whether the long game here in America feels more like a steep upward spiral or just a highly sophisticated, perpetually moving treadmill.
Welcome back. Today, we're diving into this really interesting essay. It argues America is essentially a graveyard of movements.
Yeah, the idea that it absorbs and neutralizes change efforts, almost like Afghanistan absorbs empires through sheer inertia.
Right, a provocative start. So let's jump right in. The initial premise, it's definitely compelling.
It is. It sets the stage well, America outlasting frustrating change.
But where I think it gets really original is when it shifts gears a bit, away from just passive resistance and into active absorption.
That's the key distinction for me. The Afghanistan analogy works as an opener, but it's mostly about that slow reversion, that entropy.
Exactly. And that leads to our first big point. The critique really needs to elevate that later concept, the uniquely American way of neutralizing things. The caring, curating, containing. That should be front and center in the argument. The essay mentions the system smiling, applauding, funding.
Right, filing it under corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, but it presents that as just like a slow drain. when what it's actually describing feels much more sophisticated. It's curation, it's monetization.
Absolutely. And the author does get there later, with phrases like metabolizing dissent, or that great line, Mausoleum with Wi-Fi.
Fantastic line.
But the weakness is, well, burying that insight. It comes across almost as a footnote to the main inertia idea. Doesn't that kind of undersell the most distinctive part of the argument?
I think it does. So, what if we suggest reframing the whole thesis right from the start? Prioritize assimilation and branding over just, outlasting things.
Okay, so shift the core metaphor. Instead of a passive black hole just sucking things in slowly.
It's an active, metabolizing entity. That feels much stronger, much more original, doesn't it?
It does. It immediately changes the question for the reader. It's less how long till this movement fizzles out, and more, okay, how is the system using this movement?
Right.
So, like a concrete example, maybe introduce that Mausoleum with Wi-Fi idea way earlier? Make that the central image, not something saved for the conclusion.
Yes, and pull those specific examples forward, too. The essay already has them, like feminism becoming empowerment branding.
Or BLM becoming a DEI memo. Those aren't just side effects. They are the mechanism. Use those sharp examples right in the main body to show the process in action.
Clarifying that America doesn't just outlast movements. It actively incorporates the opposition to maintain its equilibrium.
And it even incorporates the backlash against the movements, which is fascinating. The way anti-DEI arguments get folded into this narrative about meritocracy.
That's such a good point.
The system basically says, okay, we can argue about how we define fairness, but the underlying economic structure, that stays put. That level of strategic co-option, that's the real innovation this essay has identified. It needs to be the headline.
Okay, that's a perfect bridge, actually, to the second area. Dealing with complexity, or maybe the counter-arguments.
Right, because the essay, it does focus quite heavily on the rollback aspect. Schools resegregating, voting rights getting hit.
And that stuff is real. It's demonstrably true. But focusing only on that, well, it risks sounding terminally cynical, doesn't it? It opens the door to easy dismissal.
That's the worry. So, to make the thesis stronger, less vulnerable, maybe the structure needs to proactively address the other side, the idea that progress is recursive, that movements do leave things behind, the compost idea.
The compost idea, right.
Because the essay's current focus on the snapback, it kind of overlooks those undeniable sedimented gains. Think about how Occupy changed the language around inequality.
Or the legal foundations laid by the civil rights movement that other movements built on. You can't just ignore that.
Exactly. So the suggestion isn't to concede the point or weaken the argument. It's to integrate that idea of sedimentation early on. Acknowledge it.
But frame it as part of the neutralization process?
Precisely. Acknowledge stuff gets left behind, but then hit them with the real threat, that the product of this sedimentation isn't fertile compost. It's containment. It's landfill.
Landfill versus compost, I like that. It keeps the critique sharp.
It lets the essay's nuance really shine. You can confront the progress argument head on. Say, okay, culturally, maybe affirmative action's legacy of diverse workplaces can't be fully undone. But then immediately pivot to how the system uses the backlash, the push for colorblindness or whatever, to stop redistribution while maybe allowing a bit of surface-level representation.
Yeah, the system is incredibly selective about what parts of a movement it actually keeps. It takes the optics, leaves the power shift.
And we could contrast that compost idea directly. Say composting needs gardeners, people actively tending the soil for future growth.
But America mostly offers what?
Exactly. Marketers who just seal the moral energy inside shiny corporate packaging. That turns the whole optimistic counterargument into proof of the essay's main point.
And touching on inertia again, the idea that it's democracy's shock absorber?
Yeah, okay, maybe it is. But the essay needs to be explicit about who benefits from that shock absorption.
It stabilizes things mostly for the beneficiaries of stability, right? Landlords, wealth holders, not necessarily for justice.
Right, it slows down progress, definitely. But when it comes to rolling back economic gains for the powerful, suddenly inertia doesn't seem so strong. It's selective.
That selectivity is key. And it makes you think, if inertia protects the status quo, then maybe those quick, visible wins movements sometimes get, the easy concessions, maybe they're actually a trap.
How so?
Well, maybe they drain the movement's energy faster, sapping the will needed for the really long, slow, difficult work of changing actual structures.
Ah, I see. The sugar rush that prevents you from eating the actual meal.
Something like that. And that analysis, the drain from easy wins, the containment through monetization, it leads directly to the essay's really powerful conclusion, that idea that reform must survive assimilation.
Which is such a profound challenge. And it brings us neatly to our final critique.
Okay.
That concluding call to action, survive assimilation, it needs to be, well, operationalized a bit more. We need clearer strategic takeaways for activists.
Right. The diagnosis is brilliant. It nails how movements get drained and contained. But the practical advice on what a successful, lasting movement actually does, it feels a bit hinted at rather than spelled out. You know, like needing ideas to persist after the cameras leave.
But how do they persist? What does that look like in practice?
Exactly. The prescription needs to be as sharp as the diagnosis. So the suggestion here is to lay out specific criteria. What must a movement achieve to avoid getting buried or curated? And base those criteria directly on the failure modes the essay identifies.
Okay, so if the system is great at absorbing protest policies and slogans, then the changes movements aim for need to be things that are hard to brand, things that can't just be rolled back by the next administration or policy shift.
Well, maybe focusing on genuine redistribution rather than just representation or cultural optics. Things that fundamentally alter power dynamics in ways that are resistant to being turned into a corporate slogan.
That makes sense. And if the system uses easy wins to drain energy,
then the counter strategy has to be embedded in how the movement operates, right? Maybe deliberately avoiding the pursuit of quick, surface compliance?
and instead prioritizing what? Building long-term, self-sustaining community structures? Focusing energy on maintenance to fight that entropy?
Yes. Instead of just celebrating the quick, flashy wins that might ultimately be shallow, it's about building something durable.
And building it independently. Because the essay implies reformers are often critiquing a system they rely on for funding, for platforms.
So a concrete example could be suggesting activists need to consciously build infrastructure, financial infrastructure, communication infrastructure, that's independent of the corporate economy and the social media algorithms they're often fighting against.
That feels like the strategic core of surviving assimilation, true independence.
Exactly. It's moving from critique to strategy.
This has been really productive, I think. So just to recap the main opportunities we see for making this already powerful essay even more impactful.
Okay.
First, really sharpening that core metaphor. Emphasizing the active curation and metabolization over just passively outlasting things, making that the central engine.
Got it. Second, strengthening the argument structure by tackling that counter-thesis, the compost or sedimentation idea head-on. Frame it not as progress, but as a form of selective containment, that landfill idea.
Yeah, landfill, not compost. It guards against easy optimism. And finally, making that powerful call to survive assimilation more concrete, operationalizing it.
By defining specific, maybe non-market-based criteria for what lasting change looks like. Things like focusing on maintenance, resisting branding, building financial independence.
Right. Turning that brilliant diagnosis into a truly strategic roadmap.
These steps, we think, will really elevate the analysis, shifting it from just identifying America's unique power structure to offering a potent challenge and guide for future efforts.
Absolutely. So we strongly encourage you to explore these ideas, revise the material, and please send it back to us. We'd love to take another look.